Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand battlefield or a royal court, but to a place far cozier, far more aromatic, a place where whispers mingled with the clatter of porcelain and the heady scent of a dark, mysterious brew. Imagine, if you will, the flickering gaslight of a Parisian cafe in the 18th century, the hushed murmur of conversation, the warmth seeping into your bones from a steaming cup. Or perhaps you're in a dimly lit Ottoman coffee house, the air thick with exotic spices and the low rumble of a philosophical debate, a single cup of murky liquid poised before you. You're about to experience the humble origins of a beverage that would fundamentally alter human society, our daily routines, and yes, even our sleep. You might think you know coffee, but tonight you're about to learn how it truly came to conquer the world. You probably wouldn't survive a single sip of early coffee, given its raw, often unrefined preparation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, like the rich, dark liquid itself, begins in mystery, specifically in the misty highlands of Ethiopia. Legend has it that a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats became unusually energetic after munching on the bright red berries of a particular bush. Curious, he tried them himself and, feeling a similar surge of vitality, shared his discovery with a local monastery. The monks, initially disapproving and throwing the berries into a fire, were then captivated by the enticing aroma that wafted from the embers. They raked out the roasted beans, crushed them, and dissolved them in hot water, creating the world's first cup of coffee, or so the story goes. Historians still argue whether Caldi was a real person or a charming allegory, but the narrative certainly paints a vivid picture of coffee's accidental birth. From these humble Ethiopian beginnings, coffee began its slow, deliberate march across the Arabian Peninsula. By the 15th century, it was firmly entrenched in the Sufi monasteries of Yemen, where it was consumed to aid concentration during long hours of prayer. Imagine being a devout mystic trying to stay awake through the night when suddenly a natural stimulant arrives to assist your spiritual journey. It was a game changer. From there, it spread to Mecca and Medina, important pilgrimage sites, which acted as natural dissemination points, carrying the coffee habit to every corner of the Islamic world. It quickly became a staple in the Ottoman Empire, and by the 16th century, Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, boasted numerous coffee houses. These weren't just places to grab a quick drink. They were vibrant social hubs, bustling with merchants, scholars, and ordinary citizens. You'd find poets reciting verses, chess players locked in intense matches, and news of the day being hotly debated. The air would have been thick with the murmur of voices, the clinking of cups, and that unmistakable, earthy aroma. One quirky tidbit from this era is the sheer intensity of the coffee ritual. It wasn't just about brewing, it was an art form. The beans were often roasted fresh, then ground with mortar and pestle, sometimes even by hand. The preparation was a slow, deliberate process, almost meditative, and the coffee itself, far from the creamy lattes we know today, it was thick, dark, and unfiltered, often leaving a muddy residue at the bottom of the cup. Drinking it was an experience, a slow savoring of flavor and conversation, rather than a quick caffeine fix. You might even find yourself engaging in what was known as kave falu, or coffee fortune telling, where the patterns left by the grounds were interpreted to reveal your future. It was a fascinating blend of the practical and the mystical, all centered around this dark, alluring brew. The Ottomans loved their coffee so much, there were even laws permitting a woman to divorce her husband if he failed to provide her with enough coffee. Now that's a marriage vow I can get behind. As coffee's popularity soared in the Ottoman Empire, its intoxicating aroma began to waft westward, eventually reaching the sophisticated noses of Europeans. But its arrival wasn't exactly greeted with open arms and welcoming mugs. Imagine being a Venetian merchant in the early 17th century, accustomed to your morning wine or ale, when suddenly a strange, dark, bitter liquid from the Orient is introduced. You might eye it with suspicion, fearing it was some sort of foreign poison, or perhaps even worse, a subversive Muslim concoction. The first coffee beans are thought to have arrived in Venice around 1615, brought by traders who had witnessed its widespread use in the East. These early European encounters were often characterized by a mix of fascination and profound distrust. The initial reception of coffee in Europe was, shall we say, a bit chilly. It was often viewed with apprehension by both religious authorities and medical professionals. Some referred to it as Satan's bitter invention or the devil's drink, worried about its stimulating effects and its association with Islamic culture. The Pope, Clement VIII, was even urged to ban coffee, but legend has it that upon tasting it, he found it so delightful that he baptized it, making it acceptable for Christians. Whether this story is entirely accurate or simply a clever piece of PR, it certainly helped coffee overcome some of its early religious hurdles. You can almost picture him surrounded by worried cardinals, taking a tentative sip, then a wider eyed gulp, and finally declaring, "This devil's drink is so delicious. It would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." Despite these early misgivings, the unique properties of coffee, its ability to sharpen the mind and ward off sleep, quickly became apparent. The first European coffee houses began to appear in the mid 17th century. Venice, with its strong ties to the East, saw one of the earliest known coffee houses open its doors in 1645. Soon after, London, Paris, and Amsterdam followed suit. These weren't quite the quaint, charming cafes you might picture today. They were often smoky, bustling, and sometimes quite rowdy establishments, but they offered something entirely new, a public space where people could gather, discuss, and enjoy a non alcoholic stimulant. Think of it as the original co working space, but with more wigs and less Wi Fi. A mainstream historical fact here is that the first coffee house in England opened in Oxford in 1650, established by a man named Jacob, a Lebanese Jew. This might surprise you, given London's later fame for its coffee culture, but Oxford's academic environment was ripe for a place where stimulating beverages and intellectual discourse could flourish. Imagine the serious scholars and students previously reliant on ale to get through their long hours, suddenly discovering a drink that sharpened their wits instead of dulling them. It must have felt like a revelation, especially for those all night study sessions. Now, for a quirky tidbit, one of the early marketing strategies for coffee involved claiming its health benefits, often quite extravagantly. Pamphlets from the time described it as a cure all for everything from gout to scurvy and even hangovers, a claim that, perhaps, has some modern resonance. Imagine the relief of a gentleman who'd had a bit too much claret the night before, only to find solace in a bitter cup of coffee touted as a miracle cure. Of course, many of these claims were unsubstantiated, but they certainly helped to popularize the drink. It's a bit like today's superfood trends, but with more powdered rhinoceros horn, hopefully not in the coffee though. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for coffee's early European success was its exotic appeal, its perceived medicinal properties, or simply the need for a legal, stimulating alternative to alcohol in public spaces. Each played a role, but the exact weighting is a matter of ongoing academic debate. What's clear is that once Europeans got a taste for it, there was no going back. The habit began to spread like wildfire, setting the stage for a dramatic shift in social customs and public life. With coffee now firmly, if cautiously, established on European shores, a quiet revolution began to brew, one that threatened to upend centuries of established drinking habits. For much of European history, the common person's daily hydration came not from water, which was often unsafe, but from fermented beverages, ale, beer, or wine. You'd wake up, perhaps, to a weak ale, have another with your midday meal, and round off the day with more. This wasn't just about enjoyment, it was a practical necessity. The alcohol content, however low, helped kill off bacteria, making these drinks far safer than most available water sources. Imagine a world where your only reliable drink subtly dulled your senses morning, noon, and night. That was the reality for many. Then entered coffee, a beverage that did the exact opposite. Instead of making you drowsy and fuzzy headed, it sharpened your focus, invigorated your mind, and kept you awake. This was a radical departure. Suddenly, you had a choice: another pint of ale that left you feeling a bit sluggish, or a cup of coffee that made you feel alert. For the burgeoning merchant class, for scholars poring over texts, for craftsmen needing a steady hand, this was a revelation. It offered a level of clarity and productivity that alcohol simply couldn't. It wasn't just a drink, it was a cognitive enhancer. The clash between coffee and alcohol wasn't just about personal preference, it was a significant social and economic shift. Taverns and alehouses had long been the primary public gathering places, deeply ingrained in the fabric of society. They were where business was conducted, news was exchanged, and communities coalesced. As coffee houses began to proliferate, they directly competed with these established institutions. Mainstream historical fact: the rise of coffee houses in 17th century England directly contributed to a decrease in alcohol consumption, particularly among the middle and upper classes. This shift marked a significant moment in the history of public health and social behavior. Imagine the pub owners scratching their heads as their regulars started flocking to these new aromatic establishments, trading boisterous camaraderie for more focused, sober discussion. What's wrong with a good old pint? You could almost hear them grumble. This newfangled stuff will rot your teeth. One quirky tidbit illustrates this tension perfectly. Some historical accounts suggest that the wives of London's labourers were rather pleased with the advent of coffee houses. Their husbands, who might previously have spent their wages getting drunk at the alehouse, were now supposedly spending their time more productively and less expensively in coffee houses, discussing politics and business rather than simply carousing. While this might be a romanticized view, it highlights the perceived societal benefits of coffee as a more sober and rational alternative to alcohol. It was good for business, good for the brain, and some argued good for the family budget. Of course, this didn't stop some men from frequenting both, leading to some very interesting morning hangovers that coffee could only partially alleviate. Historians still argue whether this shift from alcohol to coffee was a deliberate move by various governments to foster a more productive workforce, or simply an organic evolution driven by public demand for a stimulating alternative. It was likely a combination of factors, but the impact was undeniable. The coffee house, with its clear headed patrons, became a hotbed of intellectual activity, a stark contrast to the often rowdy and drunken atmosphere of the alehouse. This transition had profound implications for the development of public discourse, economic activity, and ultimately the intellectual landscape of Europe. You were no longer just drinking to safely hydrate, you were drinking to think. As coffee surged in popularity, it wasn't long before its potent effects on the human body became a subject of intense scrutiny and, frankly, a fair bit of alarm. Imagine the 17th century medical community armed with humors and bleeding cups, suddenly faced with a substance that made people jittery, talkative, and perhaps most disturbingly, for those used to alcohol's sedative embrace, wide awake. This dark, foreign brew sparked widespread medical debates, often fueled by suspicion and a lack of scientific understanding. Was it a miracle cure or a slow poison? Mainstream historical fact: early European physicians and natural philosophers engaged in passionate, often contradictory, discussions about coffee's physiological effects. Some touted its ability to aid digestion, clear obstructions, and even cure headaches. Others warned of its dangers, claiming it dried up the body, caused tremors, and led to a host of nervous disorders. You can almost picture them, powdered, wigs slightly askew, passionately gesticulating about the perils of this new beverage. It curdles the blood, one might exclaim. Nonsense. It purifies it, another would retort, probably while discreetly sipping from their own cup. One particularly quirky tidbit from this era is the belief that coffee could cure various forms of melancholy or depression in a time when mental health was poorly understood. Any substance offering a sense of invigoration or mental clarity was seen as a potential balm for the troubled mind. Imagine someone suffering from the dreaded spleen or vapors being prescribed a cup of coffee. It might have offered a temporary lift, a brief respite from their woes, even if the underlying causes remained unaddressed. It's a bit like taking a strong espresso shot to fix a broken heart. You might feel better for an hour, but the core issue remains. The medical establishment of the time was a fascinating mix of ancient wisdom, emerging empiricism, and sheer superstition. Doctors would often rely on personal observation and anecdotal evidence, leading to a patchwork of conflicting advice regarding coffee. Some physicians, aligned with traditional Galenic medicine, worried that coffee, being a hot and dry substance, would upset the delicate balance of the body's humors. They feared it would lead to excessive heat, dryness, and a depletion of vital fluids, potentially causing all sorts of ailments. You might have been advised to balance your coffee intake with cooling foods like cucumbers or perhaps a nice bowl of leeches. On the other hand, proponents argued that coffee's stimulating properties were beneficial, especially for those prone to lethargy or sluggishness. It was seen as a tonic, invigorating the mind and body. This division mirrored many other medical debates of the era, where established practices were challenged by new discoveries and foreign imports. Historians still argue whether these early medical debates were primarily driven by genuine scientific inquiry, economic competition from established trades like alcohol or herbal remedies, or simply cultural resistance to a new and exotic import. It's hard to untangle, as so often human motivations are a murky blend of all three. Ultimately, despite the initial medical hand-wringing, the public's appetite for coffee proved stronger than any physician's warning. The invigorating sensation it provided, the clarity it offered, and the social ritual it fostered were simply too compelling to resist. So, while doctors debated its effects, coffee houses continued to multiply, transforming cities and social habits, one stimulating cup at a time. It seems even in the 17th century, people were willing to risk a little dryness for a good buzz and some lively conversation. With the medical debates simmering and the initial suspicion fading, coffee houses truly began to flourish, transforming from novelties into indispensable social institutions. Imagine yourself in a bustling London coffee house in the late 17th century. The air is thick with the scent of roasted beans, pipe smoke, and the heady aroma of intellectual fervor. This isn't just a place for a pick me up, it's the beating heart of public life, a vibrant tapestry woven with threads of commerce, politics, and philosophy. Mainstream historical fact: 17th and 18th century European coffee houses became vital centers for social, intellectual, and political discourse, effectively serving as the penny universities of their day. For the price of a cup of coffee, often just a penny, you gained entry and access to newspapers, pamphlets, and lively conversation. You didn't need a university degree to join in. All you needed was an opinion and perhaps a bit of wit. Imagine the discussions, news from the colonies, the latest scientific discoveries, a scandalous piece of gossip about a duke or duchess. It was like Twitter, LinkedIn, and your local pub all rolled into one, but without the annoying algorithms. These establishments were far more than just beverage dispensaries. They were incubators for ideas, places where men, and as we'll discuss, mostly men, of all stripes could meet, exchange information, and debate the burning issues of the day. Lloyd's Coffee House in London, for instance, became the birthplace of the modern insurance industry. Merchants and ship owners would gather there to discuss voyages and risks, leading to the formation of insurance syndicates. Can you believe that sipping a cup of joe could lead to such a massive global industry? It's truly mind boggling. Similarly, Jonathan's Coffee House on Exchange Alley was a hub for stockbrokers, laying the groundwork for the London Stock Exchange. So, the next time you hear about market fluctuations, remember they might have originated from a sleepy conversation over a cup of coffee. One quirky tidbit about coffee houses is their role as unofficial post offices. People would often leave letters for correspondence at their favorite coffee house, trusting that the recipient would eventually drop by. Imagine running a coffee house and having to manage a side gig as a mail sorter, sifting through missives while trying not to spill coffee on them. Is this for Mr. Smith? The one with the particularly loud laugh? Yes, thought so. It speaks to the central role these places played in daily communication before dedicated postal services became widespread. It was a charming, if perhaps inefficient, system. The sheer volume of information circulating in coffee houses was unprecedented. Newspapers, freshly printed, would be devoured over steaming cups. Pamphlets arguing various political and philosophical viewpoints would be passed from hand to hand. This free flow of ideas, fueled by caffeine, played a crucial role in the Enlightenment. Historians still argue whether the intellectual ferment in coffee houses was a symptom of an already burgeoning age of reason, or if the coffee houses themselves actively fostered and accelerated the Enlightenment's ideals of rational debate and free inquiry. It's a classic chicken or egg question, but one thing is certain: the coffee house provided the perfect environment for these transformative ideas to brew. While coffee houses buzzed with intellectual fervor, their doors, for the most part, remained largely closed to one half of the population: women. Imagine the spirited debates, the flow of news, the burgeoning ideas, all happening in spaces where women were, at best, tolerated in specific circumstances, and at worst, explicitly forbidden. This reflects the broader societal norms of the period, where public spaces were largely gender segregated, and a woman's place was firmly considered to be in the home. Mainstream historical fact: the role of women in early European coffee houses was largely restricted, often limited to specific establishments or particular times, reflecting the prevailing societal norms of gender segregation. In most coffee houses, especially the more intellectual and political ones, women were simply not welcome as patrons. These establishments were seen as male domains, places for men to conduct business, discuss politics, and engage in serious discourse. The very notion of a woman participating in such public debates was considered unseemly, even scandalous. You might have seen a few brave souls try to slip in, perhaps disguised, but generally their presence would have caused quite a stir. However, as with most historical rules, there were always exceptions and subtle subversions. One quirky tidbit: some coffee houses, particularly in Paris and later in London, did cater to a female clientele, or at least tolerated their presence. These were often more akin to tea gardens or confectionery shops, offering a lighter, more genteel atmosphere. In some cases, women might attend on specific days or during certain hours, often accompanied by male relatives. Imagine a woman, perhaps a writer or an intellectual, yearning to join the lively debates, finding herself relegated to a quieter corner, or worse, having to rely on a male acquaintance to relay information. It was like being on the fringes of a fascinating party, only catching snippets of the conversation. The lack of access for women to coffee houses was a significant barrier to their participation in public intellectual life. If you couldn't access the primary hubs of news and debate, how could you stay informed, contribute to discussions, or even network for business opportunities? This gender disparity further entrenched the idea that intellectual pursuits were largely the domain of men. It also meant that women often found alternative venues for socializing and intellectual exchange, such as salons held in private homes, where they could control the guest list and set the agenda. These salons, often hosted by influential women, became crucial centers for intellectual exchange, allowing women to bypass the restrictions of the coffee house. Historians still argue whether the exclusion of women from coffee houses was primarily a deliberate act of male chauvinism aimed at maintaining patriarchal control over information, or simply a reflection of deeply ingrained societal norms that saw public life as a male sphere. It was likely a complex interplay of both, with societal expectations reinforcing male dominance in these new urban spaces. Nevertheless, the absence of women from these burgeoning public spheres highlights the significant gender inequalities of the era, even amidst the intellectual ferment that coffee helped to ignite. It makes you wonder how much richer the conversations would have been with a wider range of voices. As coffee solidified its place in European society, it wasn't without its rivals. Imagine the burgeoning global trade networks, bringing not just coffee, but a plethora of other exotic goods to eager European markets. While coffee certainly had its unique appeal, it wasn't the only stimulating beverage vying for public favor. Two major contenders emerged to challenge coffee's dominance: tea and chocolate. You might think of them as gentle, comforting drinks today, but in their early days, they were exotic imports with their own passionate devotees and health claims. Mainstream historical fact: the widespread adoption of tea, particularly in Great Britain, and chocolate, especially in Spain and France, offered significant competition to coffee in 17th and 18th century Europe. Tea, arriving from China, was initially a luxury item, expensive and exclusive. Its delicate flavor profile and complex preparation rituals appealed to a different segment of society. While coffee was often associated with bustling public houses and intellectual debate, tea began to carve out a niche in more refined domestic settings, particularly among the upper classes. Think of the elaborate tea ceremonies, the tiny porcelain cups, the hushed conversations, a stark contrast to the often boisterous coffee house. Chocolate, on the other hand, arrived from the Americas via Spain, and initially it was consumed as a thick, rich, often spiced drink, very different from the sweet confections we enjoy today. It was a potent, invigorating beverage, often reserved for the wealthy elite. Imagine sipping a frothy, spicy hot chocolate, perhaps with a dash of chili, as a sign of your social standing. It was a status symbol, a decadent treat, and for a time, a serious competitor to coffee. One quirky tidbit: the Spanish kept the secret of preparing chocolate largely to themselves for almost a century after its arrival from the New World, enhancing its mystique and exclusivity. It was like the original secret recipe, guarded with zeal. The competition between these beverages wasn't just about taste, it was about culture, class, and even national identity. Coffee became deeply ingrained in the public, intellectual life of much of continental Europe and England. Tea, however, became the quintessential British drink, inextricably linked with domesticity, social rituals, and eventually empire. France, meanwhile, had a particular fondness for chocolate. You could almost map the continent by its preferred, stimulating brew. Oh, you drink coffee? Must be a German. Tea? Clearly English. Chocolate? A Francophile, I presume. The distinct social settings associated with each drink also played a role. Coffee houses, as we discussed, were typically male dominated public spheres. Tea, however, found its home in private drawing rooms and later in tea gardens, becoming a central feature of female social gatherings. This allowed women to participate in social rituals centered around a stimulating beverage, even if those rituals were confined to more appropriate settings. Historians still argue whether the dominance of tea in Britain was primarily due to trade routes and the East India Company's influence, or if it was more deeply rooted in pre existing social customs and a preference for tea's perceived gentler effects compared to coffee. It's a fascinating question of economics versus cultural taste. Regardless, the availability of these alternatives meant that Europeans had a rich palette of hot, stimulating beverages to choose from, each offering its own unique appeal and contributing to the evolving landscape of social life. It's no coincidence that the golden age of coffee houses largely overlapped with the Age of Enlightenment, a period of profound intellectual and philosophical ferment across Europe. Imagine the crackle of ideas in the air, the collective awakening of minds, all fueled by the stimulating properties of coffee. This dark brew wasn't just a casual drink, it was the liquid catalyst for a revolution in thought. Mainstream historical fact: coffee, by promoting wakefulness and clear headedness, played a significant role in fostering the intellectual environment of the Enlightenment. Unlike alcohol, which dulled the senses, coffee sharpened them, encouraging rational debate, critical thinking, and prolonged periods of study and discussion. If you were a philosopher like Voltaire, known for his prodigious coffee consumption, you weren't looking for a fuzzy feeling. You were seeking mental agility, the ability to articulate complex arguments, and the endurance to burn the midnight oil. He supposedly drank 40-50 cups a day, though one shudders to think of the accompanying jitters. Before coffee, intellectual gatherings were often held in taverns or private homes where alcohol flowed freely. While these certainly facilitated conviviality, they weren't necessarily conducive to rigorous, extended intellectual inquiry. The coffee house, with its sober, stimulating atmosphere, offered a perfect alternative. It became the stage for the public sphere to truly emerge, a place where ideas could be freely exchanged and debated, far from the stifling constraints of court or church. You could imagine someone sketching out their revolutionary new theory on natural rights on a napkin, fueled by another steaming cup, while arguments about religious tolerance buzzed around them. One quirky tidbit illustrates this connection. Many Enlightenment thinkers, including the likes of Denis Diderot and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, were known to be regular patrons of specific coffee houses. These weren't just random hangouts, they were chosen intellectual homes. Take Café Procope in Paris, for instance, which opened in 1686 and is still around today. It became a legendary meeting place for figures like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Benjamin Franklin. You can almost see them huddled in a corner, discussing the latest philosophical treatise, perhaps debating the very nature of liberty, while the smell of roasting coffee beans filled the air. It's comforting to think that such profound ideas were born from such a simple pleasure. The stimulating effect of coffee allowed for longer working hours and more sustained periods of concentration. This wasn't just about philosophers, it extended to merchants, scientists, and writers. Suddenly, you could push past that midday slump without resorting to a nap or another round of ale. This newfound mental stamina undoubtedly contributed to the acceleration of scientific discovery, literary output, and economic innovation during this period. It was like giving everyone a mild, socially acceptable superpower. Historians still argue whether coffee merely facilitated a pre existing intellectual movement or if it was a genuine catalyst, actively shaping the form and intensity of Enlightenment discourse. Did the drink itself encourage a more rational, argumentative style of thought, or did rational thinkers simply gravitate towards a drink that suited their existing intellectual inclinations? It's a fascinating interplay of cause and effect, but there's no denying that the coffee house and the Enlightenment were inextricably linked, each fueling the other in a magnificent dance of ideas and caffeine. As coffee became a cornerstone of European society, it inevitably attracted the attention of authorities. Imagine being a ruler in the 17th or 18th century, trying to maintain order and control over your populace, when suddenly these new, bustling coffee houses spring up. They're filled with people, often men, discussing news, debating politics, and, God forbid, forming opinions. This wasn't just about a beverage, it was about power, information, and the potential for dissent. Mainstream historical fact: various European rulers attempted to ban or heavily regulate coffee houses due to fears they fostered sedition and political unrest. The stimulating nature of coffee and the public, often anonymous, gathering places it created were seen as hotbeds of radical ideas. Rulers were keenly aware that a crowd of caffeinated, opinionated citizens was far harder to control than a populace dulled by ale. Frederick the Great of Prussia, for example, famously tried to ban coffee in 1777, arguing that it interfered with beer consumption and that his subjects should stick to beer, which, he claimed, was better for their health and the national economy. He even sent out coffee sniffers to ferret out illicit coffee brewing. Imagine that as a job description: professional coffee sniffer. The reasons for these bans were varied, but often centered on a combination of economic protectionism, protecting the alcohol trade, for instance, moral objections, fearing the idleness and gambling that could occur in coffee houses. And, most significantly, political control. In some places, like Russia, coffee was even associated with westernization and perceived as a threat to traditional values. You can almost hear the royal decrees thundering, "No more coffee. Back to your ale, you loyal subjects." One particularly quirky tidbit comes from Sweden. In the 18th century, King Gustav III was so convinced of coffee's negative health effects that he tried to prove it by conducting an experiment. He ordered two condemned murderers to drink coffee and tea, respectively, every day for the rest of their lives while monitoring their health. The coffee and tea experiment, as it became known, involved two twins. One was to drink large amounts of coffee daily, the other tea. Both outlived the king and the supervising physicians. The tea drinker died at 83, the coffee drinker at 83. So much for proving a point, eh? It's a hilarious, if somewhat macabre, example of early and rather unscientific public health research. These attempts to ban coffee were, by and large, spectacular failures. The public's demand for the stimulating brew was simply too strong to be suppressed. People would find ways to smuggle it, brew it in secret, or simply ignore the decrees. The black market for coffee thrived wherever prohibitions were imposed. Historians still argue whether these failed bans primarily demonstrate the inherent futility of sumptuary laws, laws that regulated consumption in the face of public demand, or if they highlight a growing resistance to authoritarian control in the lead up to more revolutionary periods. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a population increasingly unwilling to have its daily rituals dictated by distant rulers. The coffee bean, it seemed, was more powerful than many a king's decree. The stimulating effects of coffee, combined with the vibrant atmosphere of coffee houses, made them natural breeding grounds for creativity. Imagine poets scribbling verses on napkins, artists sketching ideas in their notebooks, and composers humming new melodies, all fueled by the invigorating brew. This wasn't just about waking up. It was about unlocking new modes of thought and expression. Mainstream historical fact. Coffee houses became instrumental in fostering artistic and literary movements across Europe, providing a space where writers, artists, and musicians could gather, exchange ideas, and find inspiration. In London, wits like Alexander Pope and Joseph Addison were regulars at places like Button's Coffee House, where literary journals like The Spectator were conceived and circulated. You could almost feel the intellectual energy, a collective hum of creativity that permeated these establishments. It was the original writer's block cure. Apparently, for many creatives, the coffee house offered more than just a drink. It provided a community. It was a place to escape the solitude of their studies, to rub shoulders with peers, and to engage in the kind of spontaneous discussions that often spark groundbreaking ideas. Imagine a young composer overhearing a philosophical debate and finding inspiration for a new symphony, or a painter sketching the faces of the eclectic clientele, capturing the spirit of the age. These were the original networking events, but with far more genuine conversation and far less forced small talk. One particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of coffeehouse newspapers or news sheets. While formal newspapers existed, many coffeehouses provided their own informal compilations of news and gossip, often handwritten or crudely printed, for their patrons. Imagine the buzz as a new sheet arrived, detailing the latest political maneuverings or a scandalous affair. These informal publications were not just informative, they were often witty and satirical, reflecting the intellectual vibrancy of their surroundings. It was like getting your daily dose of current events and entertainment from a very well informed barista. The long, productive hours that coffee enabled also contributed to a massive increase in literary output. Writers could now sustain their creative efforts late into the night, fueled by cup after cup of the stimulating brew. This wasn't just about quantity, it was about the quality of sustained focus that coffee provided. Historians still argue whether the coffee houses merely served as a convenient meeting point for already existing creative talents, or if the unique environment they provided actively cultivated and shaped the very nature of Enlightenment era art and literature. Was it the chicken or the egg? Regardless, the marriage of coffee and creativity was undeniably fruitful. So, from the grand operas of the Baroque era to the satirical essays of the Augustan age, the influence of coffee can be traced. It was a silent partner in countless masterpieces, a humble catalyst for genius. The next time you're sipping your morning brew, consider the rich history of creative minds who did the same. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll feel a little spark of inspiration yourself. Before the widespread embrace of coffee, and indeed, long before the modern sleep industry, with its array of soothing apps and weighted blankets, humanity still wrestled with the persistent problem of sleeplessness. Imagine living in a world without pharmaceutical sleep aids, without even a consistent understanding of what caused insomnia. How did people cope when the night stretched endlessly before them, their minds refusing to quiet? They turned to a fascinating, often bizarre, array of historical remedies. Mainstream historical fact: prior to coffee's widespread influence, historical remedies for insomnia ranged from herbal concoctions and dietary changes to more unconventional practices like placing specific objects under the pillow. In ancient Greece and Rome, poppy latex, the source of opium, was a well known sedative, though its dangers were not fully understood. Imagine the relief it might have offered to a troubled mind, quickly followed by the creeping specter of addiction. Herbal teas made from chamomile, valerian, or lettuce were common, along with advice to avoid certain foods before bed. It seems the don't eat pizza before bed rule has ancient roots. Beyond the relatively sensible, things get a little stranger. One quirky tidbit: in some ancient cultures, people would resort to placing objects like lettuce leaves, specific stones, or even portions of animal brains under their pillows, in the belief that these items possessed properties that could induce sleep. Imagine trying to drift off with a cold, damp lettuce leaf pressing against your ear, or perhaps a bit of squirrel brain. It sounds less like a cure and more like a bizarre sleep experiment gone wrong. You'd probably just end up with a very peculiar pillow and still no sleep. The understanding of sleep itself was vastly different. It wasn't always seen as a simple biological necessity, but sometimes as a battle between light and darkness, or a state influenced by supernatural forces. Dreams were often interpreted as divine messages or portents, rather than just random neurological firings. This influenced how people approached sleeplessness. It wasn't just about a tired body, but perhaps an unsettled soul. Medical approaches to insomnia were often tied to the prevailing theories of the time. The humoral theory, for instance, suggested that an imbalance of bodily fluids could lead to sleeplessness. Therefore, treatments might involve bloodletting, purges, or emetics to re-establish the proper balance. You might be feeling restless, and a doctor decides a good bleeding will sort you out. Sounds like a surefire way to lose sleep. If you ask me, historians still argue whether the perceived effectiveness of many of these historical insomnia cures was due to genuine pharmacological properties, a powerful placebo effect, or simply the desperate hope of the sleepless. It's a complex question, as human belief and expectation can play a significant role in how our bodies respond to remedies, even the most peculiar ones. Regardless, it's clear that the quest for a good night's sleep is as old as humanity itself, a timeless struggle against the silent tyranny of the restless mind. You'd think that a beverage designed to make you more alert and productive would be a universally celebrated triumph, and for a while, it certainly was. But like any powerful tool, coffee came with an unintended consequence. It introduced a new widespread form of sleeplessness. Imagine an 18th century scholar, previously accustomed to dim candlelight and an early bedtime, suddenly burning the midnight oil fueled by endless cups of coffee, only to find his mind still buzzing long after the last drop. Mainstream historical fact. As coffee consumption became ubiquitous, particularly among the professional and intellectual classes, it inadvertently contributed to a rise in sleep disturbances and a new societal awareness of what we now call insomnia. Before coffee, while people certainly had trouble sleeping, it wasn't necessarily seen as a direct consequence of a specific daily habit. Now, the link between the stimulating brew and restless nights became increasingly apparent. It was a classic be careful what you wish for scenario. You wanted more hours in the day? Coffee gave them to you, but often at the expense of a good night's rest. This wasn't just a personal inconvenience. It began to shift the perception of sleep itself. Previously, sleep was largely dictated by natural rhythms, the rising and setting of the sun, and the need for physical rest. With coffee, humanity began to push against those boundaries. Suddenly, working late into the night became a possibility, even a norm for some. But the human body, bless its stubborn heart, hadn't quite caught up with this new caffeinated schedule. You could make your brain go, but your body still yearned for its rest. It was like driving a car at top speed and forgetting you also need to stop for fuel. One quirky tidbit highlighting this shift. The term coffee nerves began to appear in popular parlance, referring to the jitters, anxiety, and sleeplessness associated with excessive coffee consumption. Imagine doctors advising their patients to cut back on their coffee nerves long before the official diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. It was a common enough ailment to have its own colloquial term. Oh, Mr. Jones, you seem to have a bad case of the coffee nerves again. Perhaps a nice, soothing glass of water? The widespread availability of coffee also meant that people could choose to delay bedtime, pursuing work, reading, or social activities long after darkness fell. This was revolutionary. Before artificial light and stimulants, the evening hours were naturally a time for winding down. Coffee liberated people from this natural cycle, but at a cost. Historians still argue whether this shift in sleep patterns was a net positive for societal progress, more work, more ideas, or if it merely introduced a new form of modern stress and chronic fatigue. It's a delicate balance, trading precious hours of rest for perceived productivity. But one thing is clear: coffee, the great awakener, also became the great sleep disruptor, setting the stage for centuries of a restless relationship with our nightly slumber. With coffee introducing a new era of sleeplessness, the challenge of conquering insomnia became even more pressing. Imagine the scene: the late 19th century, a time of rapid industrialization, scientific advancement, and a growing fascination with the mysteries of the human body. People were more acutely aware of their sleepless nights, and the burgeoning medical and pharmaceutical industries were eager to provide solutions, some remarkably effective, others utterly bizarre, and a few downright dangerous. Mainstream historical fact: the Victorian era saw a proliferation of insomnia cures, ranging from patent medicines containing dangerous substances to various mechanical devices and peculiar rituals. This was a time before strict regulations, so anyone with a catchy slogan and a bottle of mystery liquid could claim to cure sleeplessness. You'd find advertisements promising a restful night with concoctions that often contained generous amounts of opium, morphine, or even cocaine. Imagine taking a soothing syrup to help you sleep, completely unaware you were slowly becoming addicted to a powerful narcotic. It was truly the Wild West of medicine. Beyond the questionable elixirs, Victorians also embraced more inventive methods. One quirky tidbit: some popular Victorian insomnia cures involved using electric devices or even magnetic remedies. You might have seen advertisements for elaborate contraptions with wires and batteries, claiming to rebalance your nervous energy and induce sleep, or perhaps a magnetic pillow that promised to align your natural forces for a peaceful slumber. It's a bit like today's wellness fads, but with more steampunk aesthetics and less scientific rigor. You can almost hear the enthusiastic salesman: simply strap this contraption to your head, my dear sir, and let the gentle currents lull you into a state of blissful oblivion. The understanding of sleep was still evolving, while some physicians began to approach insomnia from a more physiological perspective. Many remedies still leaned heavily on pseudoscience, anecdotal evidence, or the simple power of marketing. Sleep was often seen as a problem to be solved rather than a natural process to be respected. The pressure to remain productive in a fast paced industrial society likely exacerbated these anxieties about sleeplessness, making people more desperate for a quick fix. Many of these remedies, while sometimes offering temporary relief, often led to dependency or had severe side effects. The long term health consequences of taking unregulated opiates or other powerful sedatives were devastating for many. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these questionable cures reflected a genuine increase in insomnia due to new societal pressures like coffee consumption and industrial work, or if it was more a testament to the burgeoning advertising industry's ability to capitalize on a universal human vulnerability. Perhaps it was a feedback loop: more coffee, more sleeplessness, more demand for cures, leading to more bizarre remedies. Regardless, the Victorian era stands as a fascinating, if sometimes horrifying, chapter in the perennial quest for a good night's sleep. From the peculiar Victorian remedies to the more nuanced understanding we have today, the scientific understanding of sleep, and thus insomnia, underwent a radical transformation. Imagine the gradual shift from folk remedies and patent medicines to dedicated laboratories and clinical studies. This wasn't a sudden awakening, but a slow, methodical peeling back of the layers of mystery surrounding one of humanity's most essential biological processes. Mainstream historical fact: the early to mid 20th century saw the gradual emergence of sleep science as a distinct field of study, moving away from purely anecdotal observations and towards empirical research. Researchers began to use new technologies such as electroencephalograms, EEGs, to actually measure brain activity during sleep. For the first time, scientists could see that sleep wasn't just a passive state of unconsciousness, but a dynamic process with distinct stages. It was like suddenly being able to see inside a locked box that everyone had only ever guessed about. You'd find researchers meticulously charting brainwaves, eyes glued to oscillating lines on paper, trying to decipher the secrets of slumber. This newfound ability to observe and record sleep patterns led to a much more sophisticated understanding of insomnia. It wasn't just about nerves or vapors anymore. It was about specific disruptions in brain activity, sleep cycles, and the body's circadian rhythms. This allowed for the development of targeted treatments rather than just throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. It was a true scientific revolution, moving from a hit or miss approach to a more informed, evidence based one. One quirky tidbit about this era of burgeoning sleep science is the early fascination with sleep learning, or hypnopedia, the idea that you could absorb information while asleep, perhaps by playing foreign language tapes or educational messages, gained significant traction in the mid 20th century. Imagine trying to learn French by just having a speaker playing vocabulary under your pillow all night. While fascinating in concept, rigorous scientific studies later largely debunked the effectiveness of true sleep learning, demonstrating that any perceived gains were usually due to periods of wakefulness or drowsiness rather than deep sleep. Still, it highlights humanity's enduring hope for a shortcut, even when it comes to acquiring knowledge while unconscious. The impact of daily habits, including coffee consumption, also came under clearer scientific scrutiny. Researchers began to understand how caffeine affected neurotransmitters in the brain, explaining why it kept people awake and how it interfered with natural sleep architecture. This was a crucial step in understanding the link between our daily stimulant use and our nightly struggle for rest. Historians still argue whether the development of modern sleep science was primarily driven by technological advancements like the EEG or by the increasing societal burden of sleep disorders, fueled in part by the very habits that coffee had helped to foster. It's a classic interplay of supply and demand. The technology provided the tools, and the widespread issue provided the impetus. So, we've journeyed through the energetic rise of coffee, from its mythical origins to its role in igniting the Enlightenment, and perhaps unexpectedly, sparking a new era of sleeplessness. We've seen the peculiar methods people once used to chase sleep, from lettuce under the pillow to electric devices, all before the dawn of modern sleep science. Now, as our story draws to a close, we reflect on coffee's enduring legacy and its intertwined relationship with our modern lives, particularly our cherished sleep. Mainstream historical fact: coffee remains one of the most consumed beverages globally, profoundly shaping daily routines, work culture, and leisure activities, while also continuing to influence our sleep patterns. From the morning commute, fueled by a double espresso, to the late night study session, powered by a potent brew, coffee is woven into the fabric of contemporary existence. It's the ultimate productivity hack, the social lubricant, and for many, the indispensable start to the day. You can scarcely imagine a world without it, can you? Try picturing your favorite cafe, bustling with activity, or a quiet morning at home, without that steaming mug in your hand. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? The initial debates about coffee's health effects have largely settled into a more nuanced understanding. We now know that, in moderation, coffee can offer health benefits, from antioxidant properties to reduced risks of certain diseases. But we also understand its potent impact on sleep, especially when consumed too close to bedtime. This knowledge empowers us to manage our caffeine intake more consciously. Though, let's be honest, we all have those moments of just one more cup. One quirky tidbit about coffee's modern impact is the sheer variety and specialization within coffee culture itself. From third wave coffee shops meticulously sourcing single origin beans to the rise of elaborate home brewing setups, coffee has evolved into an artisanal pursuit. Imagine a coffee connoisseur from the 17th century, used to their thick, unfiltered brew, suddenly confronted with a pour over or a cold brew. They'd probably think it was some kind of arcane alchemy, or perhaps just a very peculiar ritual for extracting liquid from burned beans. You spent how much on that single cup? They might exclaim, wide eyed. Coffee has undeniably changed the rhythm of our lives. It has enabled longer working hours, fueled creativity, and fostered social interaction. But it has also pushed the boundaries of our natural sleep cycles, contributing to the persistent challenge of insomnia in our fast paced world. Historians still argue whether coffee's overall impact on human society has been a net positive, driving innovation and productivity, or if it has introduced a new kind of chronic societal fatigue by encouraging us to override our natural need for rest. It's a balance we're still trying to strike in the 21st century. As you consider the gentle hum of your fan or the quiet stillness of your room, think about this remarkable journey of a humble being. It traveled across continents, sparked revolutions, ignited minds, and, yes, perhaps kept a few of us awake longer than we intended. Its legacy is complex, rich, and as invigorating as the drink itself. Now, as the stories of coffee and sleeplessness begin to gently fade, feel your own thoughts drift away. Allow the subtle ambient sounds around you to soften into a soothing rhythm, a gentle background hum to ease your mind. Let any lingering thoughts of historical debates or quirky remedies simply dissolve into the quiet. Your body is growing heavy, sinking deeper into your bed, feeling completely supported, completely safe. The tension in your shoulders is unwinding, your jaw relaxing, your eyelids growing heavier and heavier. There's nothing left to do, nowhere else to be, except here, in this quiet, calm space. Allow the warmth of your covers to embrace you, a soft cocoon protecting you from the outside world. Just breathe slowly, deeply, and let the quiet wash over you, carrying you gently, effortlessly into the deepest, most peaceful sleep. Good night.